Folks, so for the second time, welcome to the third round of Sustaining Peak Performance during a pandemic. This week, we are going to be talking about maximizing creativity and gratitude, and we've got two more amazing special guests for all of you. Our first guest is Dr. Glenn Fox, and Dr. Fox is at the forefront of research on gratitude and human performance. He's a neuroscientist by training. He's the head of program design, strategy, and outreach at the USC Performance Science Institute. He teaches the science of peak performance at USC, leading trainings with leaders and groups and conducting research on mindset and physiology. And he is also the chief science officer for the C. Ford Foundation, which he's going to tell us a little bit more about. And we've got Dr. Scott Barry Kaufman, the notorious SBK. Last week on Twitter, Dr. Scott Barry Kaufman shared, "Sometimes I wonder whether my potential wasn't unlocked so much as it was created deliberately and consciously through many years of dedication and engagement of a ravenous curiosity." And he demonstrates that sentiment amazingly in his work. He is a humanistic psychologist exploring the depths of human potential. He writes the column Beautiful Minds for Scientific American and hosts the Psychology podcast, which we're all huge fans of here at the Flow Research Collective. And Dr. Kaufman has written many distinguished books. Among those is a new release, which he'll also talk more about today, called Transcend, the New Science of Self-Actualization. Stephen's just been going through that and is loving it, so maybe Stephen will talk more about it as well. So yeah, huge welcome of Dr. Scott Barry Kaufman and Dr. Glenn Fox. We're really excited to dive in. And to kick off the discussion, I've got a question, or two questions for both of you, which is, what accomplishment are you most proud of? And what is the largest contribution you've made to the world that most people don't know about? So Scott, if you want to take a quick crack at that first off, and then Glenn, you can have a few more moments to think about it.
Okay. I'm so glad to go second. What was the first question?
All right, Scott, we want to know what you're proudest of. What's your proudest accomplishment first? And second, what's the thing
can't hear you? I can't hear Steve.
Can you hear me, Scott?
I can hear you, but I can't hear Steve.
Okay, so the question is, what accomplishment are you most proud of? And then what's the largest contribution you've made to the world that most people don't know about?
Oh my gosh.
A lot of unknown ones.
My greatest. Okay, what was the first one again?
Scott, you're failing.
You know, I'm really proud of the first book I wrote, was called Ungifted: Intelligence Redefined, and that to this day remains personally my most meaningful accomplishment, because I had wanted to write that book my whole life up to that point. You know, so that was like 32 years. Well, maybe I wasn't thinking about it when I was 1 month old, but let's say about 30 years, the good 30 years, or 25 years, I was obsessed with intelligence and how we're letting so much potential fall between the cracks. So to answer that question, I think it was the publication of Ungifted: Intelligence Redefined. My greatest accomplishment that no one has ever heard of is that I was rejected from the TV show American Idol twice. And I haven't told many people that.
I had that in the bio. I'd skipped over it, so I'm glad you mentioned that. Because apparently you dance to hip hop every now and then.
Oh yeah, I also was a professional breakdancer for 6 months.
Just for 6 months.
By the way, this is a rumor. This is a rumor. We've never seen it. I've been asking him to bust out and give us a demo. I've not yet seen it.
Maybe you'll be able to clear the couch there behind you at some point in the next hour and break out a few moves. We'll see. But Glenn, so let me repeat the question for you, Glenn.
Okay.
So yeah, firstly, just what accomplishment are you most proud of? And then what's the largest contribution that most people haven't heard of? Maybe they're the same thing.
Let's see. Biggest accomplishment, if I might. Oh, here it is. Here's what it is. It's that I've never had a job I've been qualified for, and I've only gotten paid to learn new things. I've never trained up for something and then gone into it. I've always gone up and then gone totally sideways. and then somehow gotten paid to do the new sideways thing. By far biggest accomplishment. I've never had a real job.
That's
I've never gotten paid to do something I'm trained to do, ever. I've always started something crazy and just been so lucky that that's been the case for me. By far, I get paid to learn stuff. It's number one accomplishment.
I love that.
Yeah, that biggest unheralded contribution to the world. Well, it isn't I guess by scale. When I was 10, I was in the movie Back to the Future 3. And I had a speaking role where I was boy with gun. So I said, here's your gun, Mr. Eastwood. And you can see, and it happened. It's a real thing. I've got an IMDb page. And that's probably, just by scale, that's by far the most number of people who are probably ever going to see my face on a screen. So that's it. Those are probably my 2 answers.
Nice. Stephen, I'm actually super curious because given the first time we've asked this question, most people actually don't know your answer to them. So you want to chime in with yours as well? Your biggest accomplishment and then the biggest contribution no one's heard of?
No. My biggest accomplishment, I would pick Rise as Superman as my biggest accomplishment because it was 20 years of research into flow till I could get there. And I think my biggest accomplishment that no one's ever heard of is I flew a MiG-17 fighter jet into G-Lock to run an experiment. But Scott can't hear me. Glenn, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Scott, you can't hear me? You want to try taking off your headphones, Rian? Tell him to take off his headphones and just use.
Can you hear me? Scott, you can hear me, right?
I can hear everyone but Steve.
Yeah, we're gonna have to just roll with it this time. So
that's fine. I'll try to read his lips.
I'll translate across.
Love you.
Okay. If you could translate after done speaking, if you could tell me what he said, that'd be great.
I'll translate over. But so one quick question to kick things off before we go to people's questions. And folks, by the way, please throw your questions in the chat and in the question bar as much as possible. So one of the big things when we did see that research on flow and creativity that we were looking at is surprisingly just literally the question of what creativity actually is in the first place. So Scott, I wanted to just start things off with that simple question: what is creativity?
You know, at the most basic level, I really like Rollo May's definition in The Courage to Create, which I think is a very underrated book on creativity. He defines creativity as simply putting into being something that didn't exist ever before. So at the most fundamental level, I kind of like that definition of creativity. But I also think that we can define it as doing anything that is novel and meaningful. So if you just have something that is novel just by itself and not meaningful, that could be schizophrenia or what people call word salads, incomprehensible. But if you just have meaningful but not novel, you have a boring lecture, where you just understand knowledge. But it's that fusion of both of those things that can really have utility value for a particular field and make sense to the experts in the field, and can really move it forward and make human progress.
Nice. Okay.
Rian, would you ask Scott why he goes with meaningful instead of useful? Which is the standard definition is, right?
It's a great question. Scott, Stephen's wondering why meaningful rather than useful. I think it's an interesting one.
Yeah, so I've heard the word useful a lot, and I don't like useful. It's very against the humanistic psychology spirit that I try to espouse these days. The point of life, according to humanistic psychologists, is to reach an end state of life where nothing is for anything else other than what it currently exists. And you can directly apprehend meaning, but as soon as you get to the word of utility or usefulness, you start thinking, well, what are things and what use does it serve me? You're not fully appreciating and becoming absorbed in the thing. And you of all people, the flow guy, should know that, the best way to stop you out of flow is to start thinking like, is what I'm doing really useful to my goals? But that's the easiest way to just snap out of it. So I think meaningful, it captures the utility aspect of it, but it's something that I think is deeper and more meaningful, so to speak.
Interesting.
I like that.
I might even just quickly actually try the same question to Glenn on his domain.
Yeah.
So Glenn, what's gratitude? Very simply.
Yep, gratitude. There's a lot of ways to define it. The more academic definition of gratitude that makes a nice place to start is that it's the feeling we have when we receive something that comes at some effort or cost from someone and that fulfills a need for us. It could be a psychological need, a personal need, a Maslowian need, or a notorious SBK new Maslow need. That's a reference to his new work. But so it's this idea that gratitude, interpersonal gratitude, is a likely result when we get something that comes at effort that helps us out. What I think a lot of the time, I think there's varying degrees of gratitude. I think it's a very nuanced emotion. And I think that there are parts of gratitude that are similar for things. If we receive a small gift, like somebody holding a door for us, all the way to someone giving us a kidney, of course. And gratitude, I think in my telling, is very much tied into the feeling we have when we have a stressor that is removed due to the actions of another person, right? So I think gratitude and stress release can be, I think in its most powerful form, are very interweaved. And that's an important distinction, because oftentimes we're conflating gratitude with happiness, or gratitude, which is general positive feeling. And it's not to be taken like that. It should be thought of in its very nuanced way, where there's almost even an element of pain, not too much, but a little bit of pain and a little bit of that very deep vulnerability when someone really bails us out of a tough situation.
Interesting. Is there a difference between gratitude and appreciation, or is that just semantics?
It depends who you ask. So I guess that means it's semantics.
Right.
I think that, I think so. I mean, I think it's good to have a little resolution around these terms. I do. I think that it's not super important, but I think appreciation is more like, the sun is coming in through the window here very nicely, and I very much can have a moment of appreciation for that. You could just as easily call it gratitude, but I think appreciation, is a more general sense of, this is okay, as opposed to gratitude, which is the way the sun is reflecting off the roof tiles is quite beautiful to me. That feels more like gratitude. The general sense is more appreciation. And it's not actually super important unless it helps you resolve and label emotions accurately.
Yeah, otherwise there's no utility of the difference in terms.
Rian, I'm going to jump in. You're going to have to translate my question for Scott.
Yeah, please.
So we have been at the Flow Research Collective. We've been working a little bit with Glenn at the front end of a long series of studies on flow and creativity. We've seen already in the early data a pretty strong correlation between people with a regular gratitude practice and people with high flow lifestyles. I was wondering about the relationship between gratitude and creativity.
Yeah, that's a great question.
For both of you guys. So please translate it over for Scott. Sorry, guys.
Scott, so we got another translation here. Stephen's wondering about the relationship between gratitude and creativity.
The humanistic psychologists, every answer is going to be like the humanistic psychologists, but they really talked a lot about creativity, and they also really talked about gratitude and the linkage between the two, because they very much link gratitude to openness to experience. Their idea of gratitude was more of like a witnessing, and more of a sort of being uninhibited by your prior expectations about something. And when you can actually get rid of all those insecurities and prior labels and thoughts and judgments about something, and we can just see something purely for what it is, the curious thing about that situation is we tend to find that gratitude almost automatically comes as a result, or appreciation, you know, and the most creative people tend to show that higher characteristic in what's called newness of appreciation. That was a phrase Abraham Maslow used, newness of appreciation, which is your ability to see something that you've seen a million times before, and every time you see it, it's just as beautiful as the last time you saw it. Or you see something that everyone has become stale to everyone else, and you still think it's beautiful, you know? And creative people tend to actually score higher in that trait.
Interesting. Glenn, you got any thoughts?
Glenn, what do you think?
Scott had a wonderful answer. I mean, I do think that I can't pull an exact research article in mind that has looked at creativity and gratitude that I know of per se. I just know personally, though, that as someone who likes to build and create things, that it's similar to what Scott was saying, that there's something amazing that I think is absolutely rooted in gratitude when we are creating and building something and we're seeing something that nobody else saw. It's inherently appreciative. It's inherently grateful to go, wow, I never thought that wood grain could look so beautiful, or that paint could lay across a canvas, or that a guitar could sound like that. And it's inherently grateful for the medium and the opportunity to create and affect something from one's own pursuits.
Is there also, do you think, potentially a causal relationship between gratitude into creativity? I know Sean Aker talks about positive affect and how that can heighten things like divergent thinking, which is obviously a big component of creativity. Do you think it can work that way as well, Scott? Where, you know, like increasing gratitude can potentially increase creativity?
Well, the emotions point is actually more complicated, because the research shows that those who are able to take seemingly contradictory emotions and be able to experience them at the same time actually are more creative. I wrote an article called the emotions, the complex emotions that make us more creative, for instance. So a lot of people tend to cordon off the good and the bad. You know, they'll take, you know, either, oh, wow, I love the moment, I'm so appreciative of the moment, or, oh, I'm feeling anger, I'm feeling anxiety. Creative people, my voice just cracked, but creative people tend to be really good at taking both, sitting with the contradictory emotions that they may be experiencing, and coming to a richer, deeper, meaningful interpretation of that emotion or that experience itself. They tend to not even think in sort of such black and white terms as even the way you asked that question, with all due respect.
So it's the range of emotion potential, like, that can lead to.
Yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, makes sense to me.
Well, it makes perfect sense from the affect labeling literature, right? That people who can better put labels on their emotion tend to have a little better resilience, and tend to be a little bit less likely to develop depression. We see it in our data that emotion regulation ability doesn't correlate with overall average increase in gratitude. This is a little complicated, sorry folks, but it's not that people with higher vagal tone, or which we'll just refer to as an emotion regulation covariate, that people with this higher heart rate variability metric, loosely defined, they don't have more gratitude overall, they have a wider range of gratitude, right? Yeah. So there's something about this high definition gratitude. Yeah, that's this beautiful thing, and it ties in perfectly with that. And we actually have open-ended questions. We ask people, what did you feel alongside gratitude? And people put often all kinds of contradictory things in there. They'll put gratitude and bitterness, which aren't supposed to go together, sadness. But if you really pay attention to kind of the modern theory of emotion and how they can be constructed, it makes sense that it's really an infinite space. And I think the better we get a handle on that, the better we're able to take advantage of gratitude and its benefits.
Interesting.
Just out of curiosity, Ryan, you're gonna have to repeat this for Scott. Being that we're in a time of crisis, I just want both of your opinions right now on gratitude and creativity as strategies for kind of managing the current situation and our emotions and our performance in the current situation.
Cool. So Scott, Stephen's wondering basically, well, we can start with you and creativity and obviously any thoughts you've got on gratitude, but what the relationship is potentially, or any of your thoughts on the current time we're in with COVID-19 and creativity.
I really do think that the moment we're in is potentially an amazing opportunity for us to reach depths of creativity we've never even known existed within us. And I phrased every one of those words carefully because I really do think that, at least when it comes to resiliency, we usually have deep reservoirs of resiliency that we didn't know existed until we're given that challenge. And actually vice versa, some of us talk the talk that we have all these reservoirs, and then when the time comes we don't have it. But we can put that aside for a second and say there's an awful lot of people where there are deep reservoirs we didn't know was possible. And I think the same with creativity. What you'll find is that a lot of people under these current conditions will have a lot of time to process things and to think a lot about what they've done in their life so far and what they want to make sure that they get a chance to do. You know, their priorities are going to snap into place in a lot of ways. You see this in a lot of the research on not only for the purpose research, but also the research on people who face their mortality through like a cancer diagnosis or something else, where all of a sudden they think about that, all their priorities shift. Their goal hierarchy, as one would say. And a lot of things that seemed to matter before just don't seem to matter anymore. And you can see it now. You can see it on Twitter. You can see people are being kinder to each other. It warms my heart to see how the situation has brought so many people together. But I also think you will see creativity as a really nice outcome of a lot of this, because people will be doing a lot of meaning making that they've never done before. And I've always believed, and I argued in my book Wired to Create, which I wrote with the journalist Carolyn Gregoire, that that meaning making is the core engine of creativity. Oh, thanks, Stephen.
Interesting. It's super helpful, Scott. I think it's fascinating. Lots of our audience has been saying exactly that as well, that as soon as this hit 3 weeks ago, like instantly everything just got clear, and all of the humming and hawing or wondering about priorities or goals just crystallized, which I think is fascinating, especially from a psychological and neuroscientific perspective. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Glenn.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think this is a great moment for reflection, right? And in some ways, first of all, I want to say, and I saw something in the comments, and I just want to express my deep, compassion and empathy to folks who are dealing with some of the more severe consequences of the crisis. We're having a talk that I want to be a little light, hopefully a little silly, a little fun, as a bit of a relief. And I want to say that with that sensitivity in mind as well. I get a lot of heat now pivoting from that. I get a good amount of heat for talking about optimism and gratitude right now. And I understand it. I fully understand. Except that if we're clear about how we define gratitude and optimism, they stop being these overarching things we feel bad for not having enough of, and they begin to become mental tools. So my word of the day is actually antenna. So I just came up with
Wait a minute. You word of the day?
Yes, my word of the day today is antenna. And the word of the day, the reason antenna is the word is because an antenna's job is to detect invisible signals and transform them and make them visible. By practicing gratitude, what we're doing is we're building a gratitude antenna. It's not that there are some days where you're not going to get a lot of good signal. The key is that by practicing gratitude on a day-to-day basis, by writing things we're grateful for down, you're building your antenna sensitivity just a little bit more every day. And it's not that you're going to go from the worst terrible reception ever. There are some days where you're not going to get a very clear picture, but by tuning and building our gratitude antenna, it primes us to feel grateful on a more regular basis without self-judgment, with deep self-compassion for the moments when we are in pain and we have anxiety and grief. That gratitude is something that kind of comes alongside with that, and we don't berate ourselves for not having enough gratitude. I think that's extremely counterproductive. The other moment of wisdom here is that we all will die. right? We all will. We all suffer. The Buddhists were right. The Four Noble Truths are pretty true, turns out. And the thing with this crisis and the moment for wisdom to me is that it's reminding us of the truth all along, that life is tender and fragile. And that, yeah, there are some fabric parts of society that can unravel with one or two threads. And that it's up to us to keep that tapestry together, and to remind ourselves of our deeper dignity and shared purpose.
That's such a great analogy, gratitude antenna. We hear people, because Stephen, you obviously recommend that people do gratitude practice in our trainings and things like that, and people talk about it as a filter, as another analogy where they start doing gratitude journaling, and all of a sudden throughout the day, because they know they're going to be doing it again the next morning, they're scanning for things to be grateful for. But the antenna analogy is phenomenal, I think.
Can I fling a question back over to Scott?
Please.
Scott, can you spin us off a little on, do you know anything about post-traumatic growth?
Yeah, I was just going to mention that.
Can you riff on that?
That's awesome. Yeah, that's a great point.
I was going to mention that because it's so tied to the idea of meaning making as the core engine, not only of creativity, but also of growth, just in general, growth and overcoming trauma. So a lot of people do get post-traumatic stress disorder after a trauma, but the large majority actually grow in some way eventually. And that had been left out of the literature, the psychological literature, for many, many years, that such people even exist. And it turns out that the number is much higher than we realized. And there are various domains that have been shown to show growth after trauma. Creativity is just one of them, but a lot of times people will report a greater sense of purpose. They'll report a deeper sense of spirituality, greater connectedness to others in a way that they never felt before, like greater feelings of love they've never had before. And they see greater possibilities for themselves, like they see capacities in themselves they never knew they had, or they see these capacities have in others. And of course, we wouldn't prefer that we had the trauma. That's not the point here. But as Viktor Frankl said, what other choice do we have? Viktor Frankl was a humanist psychologist who was in the concentration camps and wrote a beautiful book called Man's Search for Meaning. He said even under the most dire of circumstances, even in the concentration camps, he saw people were able to create some sort of meaning and the thought of their purpose of what they're going to do when they someday, once they can get out of the concentration camp, that kept them going and allowed them to do amazing things when those who were able to survive that. So there's a whole field of study, and there's some great books I could recommend on that. By Tedeschi and Calhoun have a post-traumatic growth workbook that I would recommend. For instance, I get no royalties for saying that. I really like the book a lot, and I think that, and I also have a whole section actually on post-traumatic growth in my new book, Transcend. I actually talk about that quite a bit. It's a topic near and dear to my heart, so I'm so excited that you brought that up, Glenn.
Yeah, thanks for filling in so articulately.
Glenn, there's a lot of deep stuff in the flow literature about post-traumatic growth as well, and there seem to be strong correlations, though I'd like to look at them much more deeply, between flow states on the back end of trauma rising and post-traumatic growth. It makes sense theoretically to me a little bit, but I haven't seen anything that I can look at and go, oh, this is solid research.
Yeah, I don't know of any either. I know personally that even in the times that I've been in the midst of deep suffering, that I've had something resembling a flow state, where you do have that mental clarity, and I think it's an awareness. I think there's part of it is that mental practice to be at peace with what is and letting things go, which is similar to some of the more positively valenced flow states potentially. I don't know if I answer your question at all, but
I will definitely. I've always said for a long time that one of the secrets to my career is I learned how to turn fear into words.
Mm-hmm.
That was right. And that has worked over and over and over again. Fear can be a phenomenal focusing tool if you can get a handle on it. Which is none of this Scott heard. Scott, I'm saying you have food all up and down your shirt. And
What do you guys think, or maybe there's research already around it, that are differentiating factors between folks who end up on the PTSD side of the spectrum after a phase or period of adversity versus the post-traumatic growth side? Like what differentiates? Maybe flow is one. I think Kelly McGonigal talks about gamification actually as a way of being able to transition more so towards post-traumatic growth. She did that after a severe brain injury. But are there any other ways that we can do that?
Journaling, expressive writing has been shown. James Pennebaker has done some really good research along those lines. I really recommend people in this time that we're living in right now to get a journal and to process. I mean, what else are you doing? I say that with all cheekiness, knowing this is a terrible situation, but we need to keep our humor about this a little bit as well. What else are we doing with our days but worrying? Well, at least make that worry productive. And that's the point that I want to be very clear about. It's not bad that we're all worrying, but actually a certain form of rumination has been shown to make all the difference between those who have post-traumatic stress and post-traumatic growth. You can have productive worry, believe it or not. You don't need to get rid of the worry, but you can try to process it and unload it from your working memory in your journals. Because the more you keep it in your working memory, it has actually more effects on our health and our epigenetics and all this biological stuff that cortisol, yeah.
Yeah, building on that. So some of the things that really can protect us from, so for one thing, everybody processes trauma a little bit differently. There are some predictive factors. We've studied with our work with the Reconnaissance Marines, but also with the work that I'm doing with the C4 Foundation, which seeks to help Navy SEAL families. If everybody's listening there, if everybody could at least click over to the c4foundation.org, take a look, check out what we're doing. I'd really appreciate that. It's my passion project. They're doing such good work.
Glenn, it's C4?
Yeah, here, I'll just type it in.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Throw
the chat fund. People will be able to.
So
Thanks,
part
Connor.
of this, we help. Thank you, Connor. Man, that guy is lightning with the links.
Connor's incredible.
It's
actually a lot of people are incredible on this thing.
Yeah. Dude, these comments are bananas. This is so
you got
smart.
it.
we got
They're so good. Okay,
this doesn't mess around.
You guys are crushing these questions. So anyway, let me get back on track here. But so as part of my work to design the programs that these families would do when they come to our ranch in San Diego, was trying to look a little bit more into post-traumatic stress. And we've also been doing this work with the Reconnaissance Marines and trying to look at, okay, how does the mind work? How does the mental processing of combat and that kind of trauma work? And it's just clear that you can't really draw a line through who will get it and who will not. But certain things can be important protectors from post-traumatic stress. One of which is a childhood of post-traumatic stress is more likely, or a childhood of traumatic memories, you're more likely to develop post-traumatic stress in response to an acute stressor later on. It doesn't protect. You think, oh, you get a leather neck or some thing, and it turns out the data is not exactly. I don't think this is a done deal in the research, but it's some predictive there. And then the other thing that we know is that people who are more prone to gratitude show less, not necessarily less proneness to develop post-traumatic stress, but less proneness to have the worst effects of post-traumatic stress. So they may still have a diagnosable case, but the effects on their lives are reduced as a result of their proneness to feel gratitude. And maybe that can help us here too, as we're tuning our gratitude antennas. Let's see.
It can mitigate PTSD to a degree.
Yeah. One of the commenters right now is my good friend Giacomo Bono. I hope he's still on. He's a fantastic gratitude researcher. He studies gratitude in children. But there is some good evidence to show. The good news is that, for one thing, that we're seeing that these things are fairly plastic. Is everybody back on? Okay, we got SBK.
Scott, can you hear me now?
Scott, can you hear Steve now?
Scott,
can you hear anyone
now? Can't hear anything.
Oh no.
You want to keep rolling, Glenn? I think we're just gonna have to take this one on the rocky road and keep
I
plowing.
can't hear anything.
Oh no.
We can all talk about Scott Bonder's back.
Oh man.
Whoa.
I'm gonna
Week.
Yeah, I'm gonna close them off and then pull them back on.
Oh man. Okay. This is, it's such a nice, elegant platform. If the execution is just rock solid, it's a great platform.
It's a great platform.
Well, anyway, so I hope I was asking. Yeah, me too. So am I answering your question, Rian? Is that helpful at all?
Yeah,
I mean, I think.
Super.
The other thing I can riff on while the technology here is catching up with us, in anxiety for exams, right? So I taught this to my students last week. A lot of students deal with test anxiety, and what they've actually come to do these interventions where it's very simple cognitive reappraisal to think about that anxiety in a constructive manner, to learn to distinguish the worry about your performance, the worry about whether or not you're going to go up or down or sideways, to distinguish that from just the general feeling of anxiety that we all have. I had feelings of anxiety before logging onto this. I have some mild fear of public speaking, but I love it. It's kind of my favorite drug. But I always have a little bit of that anxiety, but I don't worry too much about if I'm going to do a good job or not. Because I've found that a little bit of this helps me and a little bit of this doesn't really help me very much, right? So there is this reappraisal that we can think of. We might as well, we're stuck in this soup, right? And it's a crappy soup that we're stuck in, right? Like, it's worth thinking, like, maybe just for 30 seconds, can we make peace with it and say, I might be able to get better. And maybe even if we have to suffer some of the terrible consequences of this, of job loss, of personal injury, even then we might be able to still take 10 seconds to go, okay, maybe there's something I can still learn from this. And then of course, as feelings bubble up, they do. But that's one of those things that we see, that there is some ability, some freedom to craft the narrative around it, which is what I think Scott was saying as well, through post-traumatic growth.
Glenn, I have a comment and a question.
Okay.
You probably know this. I was in bed for about 3 years with Lyme disease.
Right.
Really, really sick. That was sort of some of the early stuff that led me to flow. And in hindsight, when I look back at Lyme disease, it was the most magical thing that ever happened to me. It was like a teleportation chamber. I was one person at the front end with a whole bunch of desires for my life and for who I could become in the world and what I could do and contribute, et cetera, et cetera. And it was almost 3 years in bed was the fastest. Are you back? Can you?
Oh my God! I can hear Steve. I can hear Steve.
I have missed you. I'm so sorry.
There we go.
Can people hear me? Can people?
That's it.
Yes.
Can anyone else?
You.
Can anyone else hear me?
Now there's gratitude
in the house.
Yeah, there's some gratitude, exactly.
I'm grateful.
I felt like I was back in special education as I was as a kid.
That is so funny.
All right, so here's my question now that Scott's back, because this is perfect timing. It was a question Connor asked in the chat, and we'll start answering your questions more in a second. But Connor said, hey, what's the relationship between the default mode network, creativity, and gratitude? And my added thing that I want to add to it is, Scott, you've made this point in your work over and over. A lot of people, when the work on the default mode network started, right? This is your daydreaming network for people who aren't aware of it. It sort of runs down the middle of your brain, sort of a midline structure that goes all the way back. People thought, oh, wow, really active default mode network seems to correlate with high depression, which is true, yet creativity requires rumination. So the question I have is, does a gratitude practice give you the ability to ruminate with less negative consequences?
Absolutely. And I am such a big fan of the default. I call it the imagination network. I've renamed it that because it's much sexier than the default. And the default mode, it's more accurate because the default mode network sounds like it's a passive system. Actually, that brain area or that brain network, which brings together lots of different areas, actually have to do a lot with meaning making, and it's a very active, constructive part. And there's a great myth that brain network is necessarily associated with negative ruminations. This is getting to your point. I wrote an article called "The Myth of the Neurotic Creative," or something like that. The myth of the neurotic genius. I'm sure someone will find it in 4 seconds, and you're going to see a link. Someone will get it. It was in the Atlantic. It was called "The Myth of the Neurotic Genius," or something like that. But in there, I talk about how when you look at the default mode network research or the imagination network research, you see that neuroticism, the personality trait, is a moderator of whether or not that brain area is going to be tinged by sort of negative thoughts. But the default mode network by itself is not like a negative, like that's not its function. Its function is to simulate the future. Now, if you are neurotic AF, you know what I'm saying? Then you know, then of course, hi, raise your hands, raise your hand, people.
By the way,
then your default mode network will tend to be, I mean, surprise, surprise, right? That's where that's your personality. But it's a really great myth that that is what that brain network's function is. The function is just to simulate the future. And there's a lot of my mentor, Jerome Singer, is the father of daydreaming. Jerome L. Singer, he just died recently, I think at the age of 90. This is very recently he died. And anyway, he was so excited to see his research vindicated through neuroscience, because he wrote one of the first book ever on the positive aspects of daydreaming. It was literally called Daydreaming, and it was in like this late 60s, early 70s. He wrote this book, and he argued there's positive constructive daydreaming. There is ruminative daydreaming. And he came up with 3 different daydreaming styles. There's the kind of daydreaming where you can't control your attention, like ADHD kind of daydreaming, you know, and there is negative dysphoric. He called it dysphoric, I think, daydreaming. But he also has a style called positive constructive daydreaming. And that shows very strong default mode network activity as well.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I got a pop psychology question that's like painfully pop psychology. Scott, I would love to hear your breakdown on creativity while in the shower from a neuroscientific / psychological perspective.
I don't know why my eyebrows just went up. I apologize for that. It was inappropriate, but and it was also involuntary. But well, okay. So here's the thing. I've done research with Hans Grohe shower heads. We looked all across the entire world. I mean, we're talking about like hundreds of thousands of participants to ask people when they find their best ideas. And more people reported having inspiration and insight in the shower than they did at work. You're reporting to have such ideas at work. That's kind of scary. Scary when you think about it. But I think in a lot of ways, if you can get into a state of a certain brainwave state, and Stephen talks about this so beautifully in a lot of his work, and he could tell you exactly what that is, theta, you know, whatever. If you get this particular state, I think things like the shower can help, but it's not like just the shower. It's not like I'm making an argument here that like there's something especially unique about being in the shower, but it's being in this state where you're you can relax that prefrontal cortex a little bit, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So we have a dorsal outer layer, and we have like the medial. Actually, the imagination network is part of the medial, the inside prefrontal cortex. Yeah, the middle. But the outside.
Yeah, we're neurotic out here. We're creative in here.
Oh yeah. Yeah, exactly. I was like, "What's that voice? Is that God?" But no, it's Stephen. But anyway, I
get that a lot.
Yeah. It was so authoritative. But the lateral prefrontal cortex, having to do with our concentration, is a great thing to have. But creativity tends to arise when it's lowered a little bit, not when it's zero. You know, you don't want to be unthinking completely. That's when you're asleep. But that it's relaxed a little bit. And I think that being in the shower can actually contribute to that.
Right. And that's probably why other recovery activities are beneficial outside of the actual recovery, like exercise, going for a walk.
So the other thing is, and Brent Hogarth, Dr. Hogarth, threw this in the comments. In flow, one of the main triggers we talk about is deep embodiment. Engaging multiple senses at once pulls your attention into the present, and helps turn off some of that rumination. And in the shower, it's very tactile. You're getting warm water beating on you, which is an unusual sensation for us, right? That doesn't happen normally. So that always catches our attention. So you see this, in the stages of the flow cycle, people be in struggle all day. They'll get back from work, they'll jump into the shower just to wash off the day, and just I'm soaping myself up requires low-grade physical movement, but you have to pay attention a little bit. And the water, the combination of that is enough. In creativity research, they talk about this. Scott can speak more about this, obviously, as the incubation phase, right? Right? There are the classic 4 stages of the creative cycle. The second one is the incubation phase. It matches with the release phase of the flow cycle. But the deep embodiment trigger seems to work really, really well for the release phase too. Like research done by my friend Lee Slodoff found that building model airplanes and building model dinosaurs is perfect for the release phase for the same reason the shower works. It's low grade. You're not really paying attention. You're paying some attention, and it's enough to kind of kick it over. I wonder, can we augment the shower with a gratitude practice in the shower? Can we?
100%. Yeah, I mean, you definitely can. And I think the one of the key elements of gratitude is that it's a low self-criticism practice when you're really having it. There's less of this self-editing, and it's rare that you're in the shower going, is this really the ideal way to, like you're kind of in that low self-edit phase that allows a lot of the better ideas to come that are under that lightly taxing place. That's where, restoring cars for me, as poorly as I do this, but
really?
Sanding. Yeah,
really?
I just finished painting my truck.
Motorhead.
I've got a 68 C10. But I'm telling you, people got to get out there and work their hands. It's something that's missing from our society. Anybody here wants to start a Zen monastery that restores cars with me, hit me up. I think it would be a very effective place. Yeah, so like Zen in the art of motorcycle maintenance, but in real life.
It's too bad I left Chimayo, New Mexico. It was
you left what?
Town, Chimayo, New Mexico, where I used to live. They call it the hot rod capital of America. There's more kind of like 1920s, 30s, 40s classic cars there, and people who know how to work on them. There's an amazing a lot of talent there. Was what I was trying to say.
Last bit, but this central part, the medial prefrontal cortex, so important for our socializing, so important for our concept of self, is also the brain region that comes up in just about all 10 or so studies of gratitude in the brain. And our study in particular that really looked at the wide range of gratitude always is going to involve that medial prefrontal cortex. And it's not just because it's a positive, happy region. It's this neat social evaluative reward system processing, and it has a motor component as well, right? That's why I think engaging some motor components of these positive emotions is so important to build that whole thing. Going back to that embodiment concept that's come up.
Can I ask about Stephen and Glenn, and then obviously Scott, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the research that we're doing on flow and gratitude and the interrelationship between those two elements. If you guys could dive a little more deeply into that, and big shout out to Connor. Hopefully we'll pull him up as well to talk a little bit about that, wherever he is there, hiding in the comments.
So we are, we started by doing, and I'll let Glenn talk more about this in a second, or we'll bring Connor on. We started by we had a really good survey, and we looked at habit tracking. So what are you doing? We looked at everything from what are your spiritual practices? What's your drug use? All that, to how much sleep are you get, et cetera, et cetera. And we looked at gratitude and flow. And that was sort of where we started. We thought we were going to see our hypothesis was we were going to see a high flow lifestyle correlate with the gratitude practice. And that was pretty clear. The next step where it gets really exciting, we can't do this. Glenn, I could talk about the ski study without screwing up the study, right?
Yeah, I don't think it would hurt anybody.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. So
don't scoop us. Do not scoop us, world.
Don't scoop us. This is our study. We can't run it because of COVID-19. We were going to do it at Kirkwood this month. The question was, can you use gratitude as an active intervention in a stressful condition? So we were going to take people skiing, and we were going to, on the chairlift rides up. And by the way, we're still going to do this. So anyone who wants to volunteer and come play, let us know. The question was, on the chairlift, if if we're going into harder and harder runs each time, we're going to use a gratitude practice versus a breathing practice versus a sham practice, and we're going to test them against each other and see if as an acute intervention, it'll produce more flow on the runs. Our theory is that that gratitude is not just this practice that you can do that sort of lowers cognitive load and lowers fear and anxiety on a regular basis, which obviously helps flow. But that you can actually use it as kind of our hypothesis is gratitude is a form of cognitive reframing. We think it's the most acute form of cognitive reframing available, and thus using it in a crisis situation should tilt you towards a little more flow. How did I do, Glenn?
Perfect.
So
Okay.
you just mentioned what the sham practice is. First, I think people find it interesting, and also it may not be clear what you mean. That
was Glenn's brilliant insight. I'll let him go to that.
Well, that's the biggest challenge in all these studies. If it's a mindfulness study, a gratitude study, anything that involves these cognitive reappraisals, the biggest challenge to designing these is always the control condition. It's always compared to what. So in our case, with gratitude, it's a very hard emotion to control for, because what's the element that you really are trying to get at that you think is unique about gratitude? That is insofar as it leads to flow. I hope this is making some sense. But so what you need is to have some sort of active, generally positive, but maybe less sort of transformational and transportational kind of emotion. So we actually think even some deep breathing would be very interesting. We want to ideally run 3 or 4 different conditions.
Oh,
but
it was math. It was addition,
oh, yeah,
right?
like math, just some sort of cognitive busyness task, just so that people are still as engaged in thinking and producing some sort of, brain map, and then compare that. So you probably need a couple of conditions, but yeah, it's like, how does gratitude itself uniquely predict increased feelings of flow and pleasure and joy while they're out skiing or snowboarding? The intermix of this gratitude, opiate, dopamine, adrenaline system blows my mind. I love thinking about it. I don't know what it is. I have no idea, but there's something there I'm excited about.
Great. That's super interesting. And Connor, hopefully we'll be able to pull Connor up in a moment, and he'll be able to chat more about that. But
yeah, why don't you kill me and pull Connor in for a second?
Yeah, let's do that then.
Conversation.
And then, guys, I want to fire a few listener questions at both of you. So one is, when giving a lecture or presentation to a group, what activity can you do together to prime their brain for creativity?
What do you think, Scott?
Oh boy.
Nothing sprung to mind, so I'm sure there's something good.
Jog creativity. Well, a lot of it is really getting out of like resetting the clock, getting out of your current state of whatever your head is in. And sometimes, just movement, like Kelly McGonigal would talk about that, it's like just getting out and doing some dancing, to begin. But also you can jog your brain in lots of ways to get into a more divergent thinking mode versus a convergent thinking mode. So you could do maybe some divergent thinking exercises or things like how many uses for a brick are there, and try to think about that. Or maybe something like ask like a what if or imaginative question. What would happen if people could become invisible at will? One of these kinds of items from the Torrance test with creative thinking, just to kind of get your start rummaging in your default mode network more than your executive the BA10, all the way up there, and the meta cognitive,
You didn't just drop a Brodmann area 10 on us, did you?
Yeah, I did. It's the very, very tip. That's the BA10 is the very tip of the latest bit we evolved,
Yes.
in the brain. And sometimes that's great and all for creativity, but if you really want to kind of get in that state as a group, it's good to start, accessing remote associations, not to be so laser focused on the task. Yeah.
What about, Scott, Dr. Brent Hogarth, one of our amazing coaches here, is wondering about introspective awareness and creativity, and maybe related to that question. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that.
Introspective awareness, like our
introspection.
Yeah. I mean, that's a great benefit of solitude. It's a great benefit of deep meditation, for sure. But the interesting thing is there's different forms of meditation that differentially predict creativity, and this might be useful for your people that are watching this right now to know that. So it's been shown that the kind of return to your breath meditation, that's sort of like your standard, if you open up one of these apps like Calm app or something, they keep saying over and over again, return to your breath. That actually is negatively correlated with divergent thinking, and it's positively correlated with convergent thinking.
Right.
But there's a form of meditation called open monitoring. I have trouble saying that word, open monitoring meditation. It's gone by different names as well. And there's actually at the creativity post, there's an open monitoring meditation that my friend Rebecca recorded. So I'll give a lot of bonus points if someone digs that up. It puts the link down there, the creativity post, open monitoring meditation and creativity. That might be enough to find it. But that form of creativity, that form of meditation allows you to let your mind wander in any direction and just simply being aware to the full breadth of all the ideas and everything that's going on. That has actually been shown to be positively correlated with divergent thinking. So many people are not aware of that, but there are some scientific studies showing different forms of meditation predict different kinds of creative of stages of the creative process. Oh my gosh, someone found it. So Kit Yetz found it.
Yeah, our chat is hot.
Nothing like crowdsourcing here. This is a distributed neural network if I've ever seen it.
Exactly.
This is incredible. Yeah.
What about, what's your gratitude practice look like? What do you do as far as cultivating gratitude in a practical sense for yourself?
Well, again, it goes back to the antenna analogy. In that I really do make a point to find a way to appreciate life every day. There's something interesting about if you think about it. So I'll tell you guys something more personal. That we're expecting our first child very soon here, right? And I'm thrilled about it. It's extremely stressful. Thank you. Yeah, it's extremely stressful to be going through right now. But we're doing it, and my wife is amazing. So there you go. But the thing is that when you ask people about that, what do people most of the time say about a childbirth? They say, "Wow, what a miracle," right? And it's so interesting that I don't know if people could still hear me. It looks like we're low on people, but the thing that I've really tried to do is connect, why do we lose that sense of life being a miracle just because we get older, when in fact the odds of living more and more days are actually increasing the odds of life being a miracle. So if you're born, the odds get more and more amazing the longer you live. And so for me, it's really about focusing on that idea that every day you can put your feet on the floor and go, wow, it's kind of my little minor miracle here. Otherwise, I do a sitting meditation. We're going to record one for an experiment we're doing. I'd love to crowdsource it here. I'll send it to the group where it's a gratitude meditation that's focused on finding things around us that we don't normally associate or think of as being capable of producing gratitude. Like this little cap to my little, this is to an adhesive spray that I use for one of my little projects. But, you think about the things, something around you, just look around you. There's something around in your office, in your near zone that took a lot of effort, to create, maybe even took the whole world to make this pen, if you really think about it. Right. So I do a lot of gratitude practice around really trying to thank the whole world for every little thing. And then you think about right now in the crisis, talk about a time to be grateful for these amazing technologies we have. We can order things and have it delivered to our food. Imagine if we were still forced, where everybody was still forced to go to do all the things that we need to do. It would be we'd be way more deadly. We're so just lucky that this stupid thing happened after we created Zoom and Crowdcast and Amazon. And I'm not an Amazon shill, but like, dang if we're not kind of lucky that at least this happened after, or happened, after we had set up a lot of really important infrastructure to live our lives. It's a benefit overall to have these things.
That's super helpful, Glenn. Thanks for that. And just to give a quick shout, for some reason I can't pull anyone else up. The crowdcast is just killing us today. But I've got another question for you both around grief. So Sandy, shout out to Sandy there, if he can hear us. Sandy mentions a HBR article that discussed the notion of anticipatory grief that a lot of folks are feeling during this time in particular. And I'm wondering if either of you have comments on gratitude and grief. That may be a more obvious one. But then also, Scott, maybe in relation to what you were mentioning earlier around negative or various ranges of emotions and creativity, whether there's an interesting interrelationship between grief specifically and creativity.
Nothing's immediately coming to mind. Maybe Glenn can get that started, and I'll think about it, because it's the topic grief is not my main area of expertise. So I need to think about that further.
Oh, good. You want to jump in, Glenn?
Sure. So I'm gonna riff on it. But there's a guy, Robert Emmons, who's probably the first and most well-known researcher on gratitude. He even talks about grief as still at least being something that we can be grateful for, as weird as that might sound. That the feeling of grief also means that we had something of value, that we cherish, that we fear its loss, right? And that when we're grieving the loss of a loved one, when I lost my mom some years ago, I really did think of that grief was my way of being grateful to her. To say, to reframe and reappraise that gratitude, to say, this hurts like hell, and that means that I am not taking anyone for granted, and so the grief at the lost jobs that we may have, maybe that's part of it, going like, wow, I actually was more grateful for that job than I thought it was, instead of flipping it and saying, I should have been more grateful or something. Maybe grief can be something that is a reminder that we are taking things a little more seriously than we thought. And there's something there. This isn't a science thing. This is more just Glenn talking, and less Dr. Fox, so to speak. But I think there is some wisdom in taking our grief seriously, labeling it appropriately, and thinking of it in terms of the benefits that it will have to make us protect the things we so cherish.
Oh, can I add to that?
Please, yeah. Scott. Yeah,
that was beautiful, Glenn. It really was. The thing about I want to just make the point that we don't have to wait until we've lost the thing to have grief for it. Now, let me elaborate what I mean by that. Maslow was working on a series of exercises towards the end of his life that would help us reach higher levels of transcendence and peak experiences, and gratitude is a peak experience. And one of those exercises was, when you're talking to someone, think to yourself, this might be, what if this is the last time I ever talk to this person? What if, do the thought experiment while you're talking to someone at the same time, where you snap into the reality of, well, this someday I won't talk to this person. Kind of cultivate that exercise while the person's still alive, and he argues you'll show much more gratitude and enjoyment and mindfulness in the moment with this person that you're talking to. So I just wanted to add that to this.
I love that. Yeah, they call it, I don't know who calls it this, but I've heard of some idea similar called the deathbed proxy. The idea of just attempting to view things, decisions, situations, even emotions from the perspective of your deathbed as well, which I think can arouse sort of a similar sense.
Absolutely.
Just on the grief note, Stephen has a really interesting point in here in the comments. He said that until the let me see where it is. I've lost the comment. 1960s. That sounds late. Grief was viewed as a mental illness. Do either of you have any comments or thoughts on that?
Can you say that one more time?
Stephen's saying that grief previously used to be classified as a mental illness or mental condition.
That's I've never heard of that, actually. Did you hear that, Glenn?
I've never heard that. No, I've heard of it for nostalgia. I know that nostalgia, Stalin would murder his troops if they had too much nostalgia. Wow. He didn't need much reason, by the way, turns out. not a great guy, but as it happens. But no, so nostalgia, I think had some sort of connotation as being something of a mental disorder. I've never heard of grief as a mental disorder. I certainly wouldn't. I think that of the emotions that we struggle with, of the negative emotions, grief, luckily, because we have Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief, is one of the few universal human emotions that we have a good affect labeling system for. That's why, partly why I think those 5 stages, and they're not stages, by the way, have become so pronounced, because it's one of the few things that it works great to be able to label the process of grieving using those specific components. And so in that regard, I think grief has a somewhat advantaged place in our emotion lexicon, because it's one of the few emotions where we've really learned to label its parts.
Interesting. That's great.
So just a hypothesis for mine.
Yeah. So interesting one for both of you, and feel free again to veer from scientist to personal with the answer to this one. If you were a world leader right now, how would you structure your day to perform consistently at peak and be focused amidst the noise and make effective decisions? The world leader sentence stem just adds a little bit of flair to the question. I think I don't know how it necessarily relates, but
I'll take a sip of my my spiked peppermint tea while
just like a world leader would do.
Exactly. Drink a dictator.
Whoa, that is quite a question.
It's Scott, you got something on that?
You know, I'm glad. First of all, I'm glad I'm not a world leader. I'm glad that I'm a creative. You know, people have to know what their talents are and strengths. I structure my day as a creative person, which I'm not saying that's the same thing. That I would not recommend a world leader to structure their day like I structure my day, but the way I structure my day works for me. You know, and this is you have to find what works for you in this world. You know what I mean? And so the reason why I'm struggling so much with that question is because you're asking, you know, you're like, who makes me an expert on that question? You know what I mean? I'd be more an expert if you asked me the question, you know, let's say I want to maximize my creativity during the day. How should I structure it? Then it'd be more in my wheelhouse. But
you want to take a stab at that question? Because I'm sure.
Oh my gosh, I stepped into that one, didn't I? The biggest thing to structure your life for creativity is to build in opportunities for surprise and inspiration to grab you. You know, see, that's the thing. So many people are focused on to-do lists and how can I, you know, hack the day, and then you think about the next day and how you're going to hack it. I think if you set a basic structure, that's good. But for creativity, you need creativity to breathe. You need creativity to like, you need to be flexible to changing the task and going back. Let's say you have 5-6 tasks. You have to be very flexible and create your day in a way where you can drop task 2 if it requires more incubation period. And you do that with self-compassion and with acceptance and awareness, and say, you know what, that needs incubation, you know. And then you do step 5, maybe jump in the shower, you know, like, but and then go to back to 2 later, you know. The thing with creativity is that it's a linear process. It's not. It's non-linear. It's non-linear. Mm-hmm. And you asked a very linear question, which is why I was saying maybe I'm not the best one in the world to answer that one.
No, well, it's interesting though, on the creativity side. And I'm curious, what are your thoughts on? I don't know if you got to check out Dan Pink's new book, When. He talks about optimal timing for work and focus and productivity and creativity, and he says that we're most creative when usually kind of early afternoon, when slightly fatigued. Do you find that to be the case? And do you have any recommendations for structuring a day around that if it is true?
I mean, I definitely find that to be the case. I definitely get my best writing done in the evening when I'm not self-editing a lot.
Yeah, right.
You know, I think to me that's the thing, is I'm not I separate my deciding from my doing, which is one of the better, you know, pop psych phrases to sort of say, I'm not going to decide what to do right now. I've already decided that I'm going to spend these 2 hours trying to create something, and who cares what happens if I sit here, fine, but I've decided to do that. So I think a lot of this really does come from self-knowledge of when you work best. I'm sure many people, I tend to be an afternoon and late night person. Many people have the same things for the morning. I think that the first thing is to keep track. I don't think it's very magical. I think using those metacognitive skills to sort of notice when you're feeling motivated, write down if you have a good creative workflow, maybe jot down, keep a journal of when things are good. I haven't read Dan's new book, but I think we are so trapped in this weird factory model of how we set up our days as if we still work at factories. Maybe perhaps one of the best benefits of this pandemic will be to show the future of work as it can be flexible, human-centered, and enhancing our ability to really work when we feel most productive. I think email, by the way, I'm just going to say this thing, email is by far the death of society. We need a new answer to email. It's not that I mind getting emails. I don't. It's that it's probably the opposite, that I'm like, oh, I could do something, and it feels nothing happens. You don't produce anything with
procrastination.
Yeah, it feels like you're doing something. So I find email to be a total creativity killer. And I hope somebody out there has a new platform or way to ping each other that's a little better.
Cal Newport wrote a book called Deep Work.
Mm-hmm.
And me and him really got into it on my podcast. I'm sure someone will find that link in 4 seconds as well. But so Cal Newport on the Psychology Podcast. But he reached out to me because I had written an article. The title of that article was "Creativity is much more than 10,000 hours of deliberate practice." And he had written an article about how creativity requires deliberate practice. So he read that and he's like, maybe we should talk about that because we have opposing views on this matter. And we really got into that because I really am quite critical of the deliberate practice zealots, who they're more just like type A personalities, I don't even know type A is scientifically valid in the literature, but that where we have to be efficient and everything has to be this linear process. But creativity is this like winding, all around curve. But I think there is a lot of wisdom. So I just want to end this by saying, and what I'm saying, my point here by saying Cal Newport convinced me by the end of that podcast that these things can be reconciled with each other, that we can still leave open enough spontaneity in the process, and that deep work is really more about getting rid of all the distractions that will not allow us to be in that full flow absorptive state. But he's not saying that within that state we can't really flow, and that's just what I was criticizing, and I wasn't sure if that's what he meant, but I'm glad that he clarified that for me.
Interesting. Yeah, that makes sense. So it's about creating the overall space, and that's the structure, and then you are creative and more flowy within the structure.
Yes, absolutely. Me too, Brent Hogarth. Is it Hogarth? Hogarth.
I called some of them on, by the way, including Brent. I can't pull anyone up.
Amazing people on this list here.
So good.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Do we have any more questions that we want to breeze through here? I looked through. We had a lot of good.
Definitely, yeah. Well, you guys want to hit this one here? Any insights on creativity and screen flickering and light spectrum of our phones, laptops, and TVs?
I don't know about the creativity itself. I'm more concerned about our actual mental, awareness, the drive to look at our phones. I think one fun thing to pay attention to is the feeling you have before the feeling to pick up your phone. And I don't think that the screen itself is the evil part, although there's data to suggest it's not, that the blue light can slow down your circadian rhythms and offset things. But I think more than anything, it's the distractibility. I've installed and deleted Twitter on my phone like 10 times in the last week. And I think that's really where the creativity killer is, because talk about self-editing. If you're always editing, should I be looking at the news? Should I be looking at the news? You won't, I doubt that you can break into a place where you can focus on gratitude or some of these states that will help us connect with this present moment.
So That was beautiful. By the way, that was beautiful. But people are giving me a lot of pressure to.
I was just about to ask you.
So I'm going to do it. I'm going to your audience is going to be the first ones in the entire world to see the revised hierarchy of needs for the first time in 75 years.
It needed to be done. This needed to be done.
So instead of a triangle that Maslow never even drew, okay, it turns out he never viewed life like a video game. Like, you reach one needs like safety, and then some voice from above is like, "Congrats, you've unlocked, esteem," and then you go up a level. It actually makes much more sense to conceptualize it as a sailboat. A sailboat. Now listen.
Can you hold it up a little more, Scott?
Yeah. Don't take pictures of it. No, because it's like this is not even out yet. This is not out. This is top secret shit. Because I love you guys, and I love you all, women as well, guys, girls, gals, everyone. And here's the thing about this. I want to be inclusive. Okay. So this thing.
Hold on.
You look at this. You look at this model. What you have is the boat.
Yeah,
the boat. The boat of the sailboat is security, and you don't fully open up your sail and move anywhere until you feel safe and secure in that boat. Right. So it shows that the sailboat illustrates much better Maslow's distinction between deficiency and growth. And that's really the essence of what he was trying to get at. So, and then at the top, from the viewpoint of the seagull, is transcendence, or the seabird. Transcendence is an emergent property of an integration of our whole self in the service of realizing the good society. That's how I define transcendence. So there, I did it. I don't know what you all think.
What was your own biggest learning while writing your new book? I'm curious.
What was my what? Sorry.
What was your biggest learning personally while writing your new book?
Learning, like what insights did I have?
Yeah. What was your biggest insight?
I had so many insights. I read Abraham Maslow's all of his unpublished journals, personal journals, 2,000 pages. Wow. I realized that he was working this whole theory, which I talk about, called Theory Z. Which is a theory of transcendence and higher states of consciousness, higher reaches of human nature. I realized that his framework of deficiency versus growth can be applied to anything in life, and it transformed my life. I start to see everything in that way now, and nothing in itself is good or bad. At this higher state of consciousness, at the highest state of consciousness, we have dichotomy transcendence, which is what Maslow called it. So all these dichotomies we have in our society, good versus evil, Republican versus Democrat, all these things don't make sense anymore. Selfish versus non-selfish. At the highest level of integration of needs, your selfishness is good for the world. So therefore, the word selfishness doesn't make sense anymore. So all these things break down at the highest level. So my whole world has changed, and I'm just so excited to share this with the world. I just hope I live till next Tuesday for this to come out. I mean, I just hope. I pray to COVID. I'm like, COVID, can you keep me on this earth at least till the book release?
Nice timing in certain ways. I mean, it's going to be helpful to people at the moment, big time. What do you talk about?
I hope so. Absolutely. I actually give a big shout out in my acknowledgments to Stephen Kotler. Nice. I love flowing with him about this topic of flow, but I could flow as part of the concept Maslow talked about, peak experiences, but I view peak experience as a broader label. So we can have a whole continuum. I talk about the unitary continuum of transcendent experiences that can go, and flow is actually on the lower end of the continuum. And not saying it's calm down, Stephen. And not saying that means it's not. I'm not saying it's not as good. It's not competition. It's not.
Dropping an angry email right now.
No, but it's in the whole continuum. You can build up to the most profoundly transformative transcendent experiences, where our entire worldview and system of life has changed for us, and we have this what are sometimes called a mystical experience. But there's gradations all along this pathway, and I talk a lot about that continuum in the book.
Amazing. Thanks, Scott. So guys, I'm going to do one question from Stephen here, and then I want to fire two more at you, and then we can wrap up if that works for both of you. And before we wrap up as well, I would love for you both to just share more about where people can dive deeper into both your work. So this one's for Scott, but Glenn, I'm sure you've got some thoughts as well. Scott, which of the humanist psychologists do we know the least about, but are potentially the most important?
Karen Horney is the most underrated psychologist in the history of psychology, and especially within the humanistic movement. She was the first humanistic psychoanalyst. Take that phrase, you don't hear that one often. Freud was definitely not a humanistic psychoanalyst.
Yeah.
He believed that all of our, at its base, everything can be chalked up to our either sexual or aggressive instincts, including our transcendent. He would say that our most transcendent experiences, like the mystical experience, he called it an erotic return to the womb. That's what he called it, okay? Karen Horney had a much more constructive, positive view of humanity. She believed that we're capable of growth and change up to the end of our death. By the way, she was also a feminist psychoanalyst, and she was the first one to challenge Freud and say that he was nuts. So I think she's really underrated. But I also think like Rollo May is incredibly underrated. You may have heard of the classics like Carl Rogers, Erich Fromm, Abraham Maslow, but Rollo May wrote beautiful things. He wrote the book Love and Will, for instance, which is absolutely beautiful. Also, right. Alfred Adler. I can keep going on and on and on, but Alfred Adler was amazing.
You got any, Glenn?
Oh, unheralded humanistic psychologists?
Yeah.
No, I wouldn't. I don't know if I consider myself a humanistic psychologist per se, although I probably am. But I do think if you're interested in research on optimism, there's a researcher named Lisa Aspinwall who has done a ton of great research, and I don't know where she is or what she's doing. She did a lot in the 90s to really hash out what we know about optimism as a cognitive, framing toolkit. And her research is fantastic, easy to read, very accessible, and I think worth a read if you want to dive into literature.
Super. Okay, that's helpful. So, second last question then that I'm really curious on from both of you. Both of you have incredible minds and have read God knows how many books and papers. So I'm curious, what belief or skill has been most helpful to each of you personally throughout this whole experience of COVID-19?
Idea or what? What was the other option I had?
What belief or skill?
I think. Oh, go ahead, Scott.
I was gonna say, is it too corny to say mindfulness? Because I feel like that's the answer to everything these days. But I actually really do mean that. I have found that this practice and this constant practice of decoupling my thoughts and my fears and anxieties from myself and projected onto a screen when I close my eyes. I don't do the return to breath one as much as I do in terms of trying to take all my mashugana, as my grandmother would say, and pretend that I'm viewing it on a screen like a movie, and it's a horror movie. but it's not me, right? It's the movie.
Yeah.
If I do that 15-20 minutes a day, I'm in a much better, loving, calm state the rest of the day.
No, that's super helpful, I think, Scott. Yeah, thanks for sharing that.
Great.
I probably have the same answer. I would call what I'm thinking a lot about is curiosity, and that staying curious about this moment has been really interesting, a great way to cope. I'm fortunate in that I spend my life thinking about how the mind works, and so the quarantine is just is another way to do that. I also I guess the other skill I have is that I like to build things, so it's kind of handy that I can work in the shop a little bit, and that's definitely the skill that's been the most useful, is being able to still be creative, to still work with my hands. I'm trying to get good at CNC machining things. So I have a little CNC machine in my background. I don't know if you could see it there.
Oh, cool.
So I've been playing with that. But I think curiosity as a general trait, I loved Scott's tweet earlier, Ravenous Curiosity, because I really think it solves a lot of problems. When you can be curious about pain, curious about suffering, it does separate things, that internal suffering story from just curiosity about like, wow, this hurts. This sucks. Interesting. It sucks that it's, it doesn't suck that I think that it sucks. It just sucks, and that to me has been the most useful coping mechanism. And also that we're lucky too that we can beat this thing by sitting here, and it's very painful, and it's not without cost. This war we're waging is with cost. To sit here and to be isolated from each other is a huge cost to our mental health, but we are lucky that this is extremely effective. We'll shut this thing down. If we really do stick to our guns, it'll go away. And so we're lucky we can do this. So in that regard, I feel really fortunate that we know what to do. And that luckily we've been training our whole life. It's like, get in your pajamas and watch TV and you're fighting.
Everyone's been prepping.
So true.
So final question for you both, and this can be research backed or purely opinion based. And it's simply, what is a parting word of wisdom or advice that you would have to all of our listeners here on how to thrive and use this experience as best as possible over the next couple of months or however long it ends up lasting?
Can you ask the question one more time? I was texting Stephen Kotler.
That was distracted our guests. What's one piece of wisdom or advice? It can be research backed or purely opinion based that you would leave people with to help them just use this experience as positively as possible, and ideally use it as a means of thriving.
I would say, social connection, social support is the #1 predictor of mental health, right? And that's why this is such an impoverished feeling experience. But luckily, pick up the phone, call someone, say hi. I think we're getting a lot more phone calls. So my research-backed and practical thing is like, use it, and also really listen. Use the time flexibly to set a routine that you actually think works for your own productivity. I really am not sleeping with an alarm, which is really nice.
Nice.
And so this is a great way to do those hacks, which I hate that term, but this is the time to try those hacks out to make your best day possible through experimenting with when you want to work, what kind of things make your heart sing when you're really thinking and working about them, and then call your old friends. I need to call back 3 or 4 of my friends, so apologize to them if they're out there. But that to me, if I can do those 2 things with a lot of self-compassion for when I do feel stressed and I'm like, this sucks, and I can take my foot off the gas completely without any judgment, those 3 things: connect with people, build some new skills to understand when I'm productive, and then give myself a damn break when I need it. Those 3 things, I will feel like, all right, good enough.
Love that, Glenn. That's great. The idea of using it as almost like a petri dish for self-experimentation. That's cool.
Thank you.
Scott, one thing I just want to mention on Scott's front is that some people are already pre-ordering your new book. So maybe you want to give a quick shout to that right now as well. Our rapid fire audience are already on it. But yeah, Scott, do you want to share yours and then also talk a little more about how people can go deeper with you? And then I'll throw that to you as well, Glenn, before we wrap.
Yeah. So a big mission of mine is to suggest to people that they don't neglect their higher possibilities. So I understand in the time we're living in, we're all being pitched into a state of psychological insecurity, what some psychologists call psychological entropy. But that doesn't. We must make sure that we don't snap so focused into that state that we forget that there still exists beauty in this world. There still exists beauty within us. I thought I'd leave the last words to my homeboy, Abraham Maslow, who I mentioned 500 times today, but I rounded up a bunch of, he died suddenly of a heart attack at the age of 62. And very end of his life, he was working on a whole series of exercises to help people live more in the be realm of human existence, the being realm, the realm of where growth happens, as opposed to the deficiency realm. We're all living in the deficiency realm right now, but I want to help people and show people we can still live in the be realm. At the same time, we take care of our basic needs. There's still higher possibilities. So I just want to read one of the exercises. Engage in deliberate experimental philanthropy. If sometimes you are no good for yourself, depressed, anxious, at least you can be good for someone else. So I wanted to leave with that.
I love that. That's great.
So good.
What a great plug for the book as well.
Thank you. You all have been doing a much better job plugging my book than I have plugging my book today. So I just want to thank everyone. It's such a honor to be here today with everyone. But yeah, my book does come out Tuesday, and I put 5-6 years of blood, sweat, and tears into that, and hoping it can still help people transcend even in this time that we live in.
Amazing, Scott. Do you want to just restate the name, but where people can get it as well?
Yeah. Here's the cover. It's called Transcend the New Science of Self-Actualization, and you can get it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, indie bookstores. You can pre-order it right now on Amazon if you want. It's there. But on my webpage, scottbarrykaufman.com, under books, Transcend, if you go on my website, I have a list of a lot of the links of the different bookstores. Because some people are like, I don't like Amazon. And I was like, okay, I don't know why they don't like it, but they're like, I refuse to buy books from Amazon. So just for those people, just so you know, there are other places you can buy it. Calm down. So, yeah.
Yeah, by the way, the cover art is epic. I don't know who did that, but I was telling Stephen earlier, it's amazing.
There's a lot of meaning to it. It was done at the publishing house, but there's the sailboat, so it's very subtle. But now there's no more triangle anymore. Now we all have a whole integrated vehicle that's going through the unknown of the sea, and we're all in the sea going in our own direction in our sailboat. So we're all in this together. There's so many aspects of this metaphor that I think work for the time that we live in. So,
amazing.
Anyway.
Thanks, Scott. That's epic. And Glenn, you want to share any ways people can dive deeper or support, whether it's the work?
Sure. I mean, yeah, definitely. If people can plug into c4foundation.org and support Navy SEAL families, those guys are still shipping over, and the spouses are here. The stress on them is immense. Really proud of the work that we're doing there. So jump over and give them a like or follow. If you want to observe my random ramblings on Twitter, I'm the least branded person on Twitter. I tweet about cars and whatever things, but I'd love if somebody would like respond every once in a while. But I don't. That's fine. If you want to join me, I'm at Glenn R. Fox. And then on LinkedIn, I'm a little bit more active there, but I still enjoy Twitter very much, so I'd love to make some new friends that way. So hit me up, go support C4, and please, everyone, just take deep care for yourselves. I really appreciate the comments and the thoughtfulness behind this. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to sit with Scott, whom I admire so much, and Stephen, wherever he went, and just really grateful for the chance to sit with you all. And especially to the folks out there who are listening, we're all in this together. So take great care.
Thanks so much, guys. You've been amazing. And huge thanks to the whole Flow Research Collective crew as well. All of our team. Shout out to Claire, Brent. Massive shout out to Connor. I'm so sorry the Crowdcast blocked us from getting you on. And same with Stephen. We lost Stephen, unfortunately. But also a huge thanks to our whole audience and all of you guys for joining and bearing with the tech troubles. You're amazing. Almost everyone migrated across, at least of the live viewers. So huge thanks for that. We'll send out the replay. And until next time, all the best, folks. Thanks a million.
Everyone stay safe.
Thanks, guys.
And transcendent.
There you go.
At the same time, both are not mutually exclusive.
That's sailboat. Thanks, guys. Take care. All the best.